SA-93. That's not an AKM. Hi, Misha here, and that's kind of the purpose of this video. This is the last in our AK week video series, kind of something I threw together impromptu. We're going to compare and contrast various makes and models that would be considered AKMs, or maybe not so much. But either way, we're going to be focusing on stamped receiver guns in 7.62x39 with 16.25-inch barrels, produced, 1960 and later on. Just showing what is and isn't, and the differences and similarities, talking about the history and the mechanics for some point. And that's about it, just digging into the history of these guns. Some we've revisited very recently, but they're applicable to this video too. Others we haven't talked about in a minute. So with that, these are all derivatives to some extent. But let's look at our baseline, the original Soviet Russian. But first, as always, if you could, do please like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to help support the channel, please check out the link to the Patreon page, because these videos do take a minute to record. Anyway, enough of that. Let's get on to the meat of it. So to get started, let's talk about our baseline. What is an AKM? This is my Russian build from Legion USA. It is from a matching original AKM parts kit, a later production one from the 70s. Fixed stock, bayonet. It does have a cold hammer forged chrome lined barrel, and this is one of the Childers receivers, originally made from a Polish stamping. So yeah, as close as we're really going to get, and that's kind of why I wanted it, is because it's a great representative of just an AKM, an automatic Kalashnikov modernized. So what was the idea behind this? Well, the original AK did have a stamped receiver, although it was a different pattern. The Type 2 and Type 3, as we call them, had machined milled receivers. And these would last through 1959, when the AKM was adopted. Now, as early as 1954-55, specifications and early work had begun on the AK's replacement, the original one. The new rifle needed to be lighter and more economical to mass produce, and trials would be held, and then this would be adopted. And in most every way, it was superior, at least in an overall sense, to the original AK, what we refer to as the AK-47. So, like the original, it had a 16.25-inch, 415mm barrel. But to save weight, it is of a thinner profile, lighter profile. And like the original, it was threaded 14x1 left hand. But, unlike the original, which typically just had a muzzle nut, it had a new muzzle brake or recoil compensator. Now, the original AK had a bayonet, but it was a last-minute addition to the design, so it kind of locked under the front sight. The AKM had a true dedicated bayonet lug located under the gas block, and its bayonet here would serve as a tool, not only a bayonet, but a wire cutter. It had redesigned forearm with palm swell and a synthetic pistol grip. And it had a redesigned buttstock with a single tang on top with 2 screws, 1 internal, 1 external, versus the 2 tang with 3 screws in total system of the AK. And it went from the heavy slab side look top cover to the thinner and ribbed top cover. And of course, the biggest deal, it had a stamped receiver. Now the original AK Type 1 was also a stamped receiver, but this was a new pattern. It had a forged front trunnion riveted in, and a rear trunnion. Now, earlier production guns had a machined rear trunnion. Later, it would be a cast one. And this really did help save weight. They did a lot of other small things to continue to help save weight. For example, the bolt and bolt carrier were given lightning cuts, although the very, very earliest production models from 1960 may not have these. And various things like the gas block and front sight base would have lightning cuts given. And here is that new pattern of bayonet attached. It's just a different pattern. And another thing, the magazines. The original AK used slab side mags that were very heavy gauge stamped steel. They did experiment with an alloy type magazine, but it was much lighter, but also weaker. They went to a thinner ribbed pattern, the more common one, that was 20, even 25% lighter. Of course, later, beginning in the late 60s, early 70s, we'd also have some AG4, so-called Bakelite mags. Either way, because 3 to 5 mags were issued per gun, getting the lighter mags really did matter. Now, there were some mechanical changes too. They hoped to improve accuracy and handling and controllability, especially in fully automatic. That actually explains the new angle of the stock. Now, internally, they went from a double hook trigger to a single hook, and they introduced what is often referred to as the out of battery safety or the rate reducer. So it had a slightly lower cyclic rate, and it made sure that the hammer would not release until the bolt was fully in battery. And these palm swells in the handguards also gave a better purchase, again during full auto. And finally, this muzzle compensator recoil check. The reason it's kind of at an angle is to counteract the muzzle climb. And finally, they switched the spring button from the left to the right over here, and they went from an optimistic 800-meter rear sight to a ludicrously optimistic 1,000-meter rear sight. And notice this did not have a scope rail. Scope rails were not standard for the AK or the AKM. Now, all the changes they did had several notable effects. For one, this was about 1 kilogram lighter. It went from over 9 pounds to right around 7 pounds, give or take the wood. They also would change the finish up. We'll talk more about that later. And this was obviously cheaper and faster, more economical to mass produce compared to the original. I mean, stamped versus milled. They had basically worked out all the kinks. Sometimes I hear this receiver referred to as the Type 4. Makes sense. This was the version, a handful of countries manufactured the AK under license, but over a dozen would make the AKM or, closely related variants. So with that, let's compare and contrast to see who made the closest and most, authentic, and also who made the most unique and kind of, off-script versions. Now, my gun up here is a kit build. That's because no semi-automatic civilian legal AKMs were imported from Russia. No, a Sega, no, a Vepr is not an AKM. As I'm sure you know, probably the most authentic, correct AKM to ever get imported was the Egyptian ARM, or Egyptian MISR, MISR, produced by Factory 54, the Mahdi factory, right outside of Cairo, Egypt. Here's mine. It's actually wearing the unique Egyptian folding stock, but here's its, Woodstock. And these really were correct pattern. And production would be set up in the late 60s, so the Russian version would be copied from that, meaning they still had machined parts. They had the paint over phosphate type finish, and they had furniture made from laminated wood most of the time, put together with pins running through. Note that the bolt carrier is painted. Now, since this is a kit build, the paint's not 100% correct. It's really the only thing that's a little off about this Legion USA build. But this one, gloopy paint and all, is a great example. One of the few places Egypt slightly deviated was the pistol grip. They used a different type of synthetic material, and they had the concave pattern of checkering. Actually, first made by Molat versus the convex here. Still 7.62 by 39, still using the same mags. Egyptian mags look very much like Russian. And in the pre-ban era, these were imported by Steyr, but only about 2,000 to 2,500. In the post-ban era in the 1990s, they were imported by a few companies, including Pars, or Intric, or Century Arms. They're still threaded 14 by 1 left hand, and they would take a standard AKM bayonet. So this is a very, very close, essentially almost completely clone correct AKM. Note that the Misser, the ARM, the Misser was kind of the internal name, ARM was for export, still does not have a side rail. One neat thing about this type, this pattern of folding stock, is it fits into the standard rear trunnion. That's how you can switch back and forth between fixed and folder easily. It was actually originally invented in East Germany. But these are well-made guns in terms of reliability, although the craftsmanship on Egyptian guns, much like a lot of the mass-produced Russian guns, isn't perfect. For example, my bracket for the upper handguard is welded on kind of crooked in the front, but not in the back, so that's fun. And the paint was often uneven and kind of gloopy, and the trigger was less than fantastic. But they are good guns, and if you want an actual imported gun, this is as close to an AKM as you're really going to get. And as is famously known, these originally shipped with certificates of authenticity for what it was. But they haven't come in a while, and there are plenty of kit builds besides. Here we have another kit gun. This is a Polish Circle 11, today FP Radom, KBK AKM. Poland had built the milled AK, unlike Egypt that never did, and they transferred to producing the AKM in 1966. And for the most part, they did closely copy Russian. Now, since my Russian gun is a 70s production, it does have the cast gas block, and this has the original machined. But there are some interesting differences, especially guns built in the 60s running up through 1970. For one, Poland used hardwood furniture versus the laminate style, at least for the buttstock and the lower handguard. As far as I know, the upper was always kind of a laminate or kind of composite type wood, probably because of its shape. Poland also used an interesting type of pistol grip. In fact, they would use several styles over the years. This is the earliest type. And they would continue to use muzzle nuts for a time. One neat thing about this nut, it's actually the late pattern muzzle nut with the secondary lightning cut right here. But it still took the standard bayonet lug, standard lightweight barrel, standard palm swell handguards. So mostly standard, and by default did not have the side rail. Flipping it over, another unique feature of the earlier production Polish AKMs. While they went to the lightning cut bolt and carrier, they kept them in the white, and this isn't raw steel, of course it is treated, but this is something that was a carryover from the original AK. They eventually would go to painting them, of course, but up until about 1970 they were kept in the white. Also quite interesting, the other metal would remain blued up there about 1969, as opposed to the paint over phosphate. That, along with the hardwood, just kind of gives these an interesting look combination of original AK and AKM. And of course the Polish quality, the fit and finish were outstanding. But Poland, beginning in the 70s and running through the 80s, would update, kind of keeping up with modern trends as well. Okay, you knew I had to bring the WBP jack out again, even though we just looked at it, because this is a great example of a later production Polish AKM. Almost perfect, except for two things. This does have the later style cast gas block and front sight base, things that Russia went to in the 70s, Poland would switch over in the 80s. It also has the laminated furniture, and it has the later style convex checkered pistol grip. It also has the Polish paint finish. So all later features. The only two areas this doesn't work, it even has the later style takedown button catch with the lip. The only areas it really doesn't quite stack up, it still has the bolt group in the white. Later Polish ones should be painted. And it has the kind of tantal style, thicker, smooth top cover. Goes to show you, even very close clones and copies still kind of do their own thing. That makes sense. But yeah, this is the best option, along with the Fox, if you want a Polish AKM import. Otherwise, you can do a kit build like the one we just looked at. But as far as imports, this is the first and really only Polish AKM we've ever had. I'm not going to count the PAC guns, sorry. But there are plenty of awesome condition parts kits if you'd like to do something a little different. Just thought I would bring it out for a minute. Really do like this gun. East Germany, the DDR, would actually follow a very similar path to Poland, originally producing a modified version of the AK, and in the mid-60s switching over to the AKM, known there as the MPI-KM. And this is an earlier build again, very similar to the Polish one you saw. And like Poland, they would actually initially do blued finish, switching over to kind of a matte gray type paint phosphate later on. And again, they would originally use all the machined parts, same barrel, and they would have a compensated barrel. Now, some early ones could also have muzzle nut. This one actually has the type of compensator with the enlarged flange in the back. Little details like that. Of course, the thing to note here is the furniture. A synthetic buttstock without storage compartment. It's actually quite hollow. Quite a unique shape pistol grip. It's actually based on the AK pistol grip, the kind of eye style, but made of polymer. A polymer upper handguard and a hardwood, I think it's beechwood, lower. And as is famously known, originally they tried using this plastic lower, but they were melting under heat, so they kind of went back to the wood. Later versions, like the MPI M72, would go to kind of a Bakelite and AG4 material lower handguard. Quite unique. And as I said with the Egyptian gun, they would actually be the originators of the swappable rear stock to go to the side folding pattern. Quite neat. Unfortunately, we've never had any semi-automatics from Germany or East Germany, as you might imagine, so they're all kit guns. But that's not a bad thing. The Soviet AKM is already quite a light gun at 7 pounds, even a hair less. But actually, the East German MPI-KM was even lighter, closer to 6.5. And it was the lightest AK, excluding shorties and kind of let's say it was the lightest AK with a full 16-inch barrel, due in large part to the furniture. Now, these are well known for their unique markings and just overall great quality of machining, German standards. As far as the metal goes, there's really only one major difference. That's because of this sling. Now, for the buttstock, because this is a relatively narrow and light sling, I might mind, the swivel on the back is small, only about 1 inch wide, whereas on a standard AK here, it's a little wider. By the way, since this is a late production stock, it's on the side. Earlier ones in Russia would be on the bottom. Now, the front on the Russian gun and most others has a small loop with a hook. On the East Germans, they did away with the hook system, again to save a little weight, and instead made the loop quite a bit larger to work with this. So that's the one big difference in the metal, is the enlarged loop here compared to up here. That also means that an East German sling like this won't just straight fit on a regular AK, although they did have a hook version later. And again, they had an updated version with a Bakelite lower and a folding stock known as the M72. And East Germany would actually be a major manufacturer of military AKMs. Those are for export, namely. In fact, I think they were the 3rd largest in the world at the time. And they too would continue to make the kind of ribbed pattern magazines, originally blued, later painted. But again, unfortunately, we've never had any true imports, and even parts kits have been hard to find over the years. But it's pretty darn close to original Russian pattern, except for different furniture and the modified sling loop here. Otherwise, took the same type of bayonet, and scope rails were still not a standard with these. Last mag with the SAR-1 at dark, no flash hider. Wolverine. Alright, it's time to get to Romania. And because these have been imported for so long and in such large numbers, people think they've been around forever, but actually there were no pre-ban era Romanian semi-auto AKM type imports. In fact, the first ones did not show up until 1997. But 25 years later, they are quite arguably the most common AK in the USA. And of course, the SAR-1, the one I've talked about ad nauseum. Now, Romania, they started producing the PM63, their AKM variant, in 1963. They had issued the original milled AK, but they never produced it in country. At most, they might have assembled some using Russian parts. And in the beginning, it was a very close version, clone copy. But they would soon, within a few years, add the distinctive foregrip, the dong as we call it. And that was mainly for domestic issue guns. And they would use a few different finishes over the years, namely either salt blue or phosphate. They didn't typically do the phosphate with paint over it finish. And their wood would either be laminate or sometimes hardwood. Early pistol grips would be wood, but very soon they would go to synthetic. And they too would use the inverse checkering. But in other ways, they were very, very standard. Oh, and they did typically use a muzzle nut on the PM63. Otherwise, yeah, pretty straightforward. Intentionally keeping this one up here as a comparison. But yeah, flipping it over, no surprises here. This one has the later style button. There's all kinds of variations I've talked about in past videos for the Romanian guns. They never did go to the Russian style of cast gas block, although they would do their own. Yada yada yada. But like I said, this is my SAR-1. It's very close to the Romac 1, the WUM 1, those early ones. But of course the gun that most people are familiar with. The Wasser 10 first appeared in 2003 and then soon followed by the GP Wasser 10 at the end of 2004 with the end of the assault weapons ban. The big difference here, of course, it no longer has magwell dimples in the receiver. And there are tons of varieties of these. I wanted to bring this out too because it has the Palmswell handguard. Whereas the dong was made for the PM63, the AIM, the export variant, typically had the Palmswell, also versions made for the Romanian Navy. And this is in a PM90 configuration, which was kind of Kuger's rebranding for the 1990s of the PM63. They typically use the side folding stock. This is a simplified version of the East German, Egyptian, or even Polish type. And this is when they started to really fit these typically with the AKM slant type compensator. And one other thing. With the military PM90, and of course pretty much all the exports and models we've received, the side rail was a standard. Over in Russia, and for most of the military production, this was the AKMN rail, and it was kind of a specialty. But because pretty much all of our Romanian imports have the rail, people think it's a common feature for the AKM, but it really wasn't. Not until later production models and newer ones. It would become standard in Russia with the AK-74M, the AK-103, that series. But before that, it was a special deal. But I just wanted to bring this out real quick just to point out the rail. Of course, the newer sling. And these are very, very close to AKM. This with a few differences. With the Wasser, yeah, the magwell, the scope rail, and the fact that these typically have a phosphate finish instead of paint over park. So they're very, very close. They're almost as close to an AKM as the Egyptian Misr ARM, but that ARM is just that hair more AKM-y than the SAR-1 or the Wasser 10. So something worth pointing out. Romania continued to build the ribbed pattern magazine. They were one of the few countries to not only do the 30-rounder standard, but also a more compact 20-rounder. Just thought I'd point that out. Speaking of, the nation that's probably most famous for 20-rounders. Much like with the WBP Jack, even though we just looked at, in the last video, this gun, the Hungarian FEG, we have to talk about it again, because it applies in this video. Yeah, Hungary was another major producer and user of 20-round mags, mainly in the AMD65, but also the AKM63 here, and part of it was their unique vertical foregrip. Unlike the Romanian grip, this is not integral to the handguard, so it could be replaced or removed. The Hungarians at the FEG factory, Factory 02, did build the original AK Type 3s, the AK-55, but in 1963 they would transition over to an AKM variant, actually making them one of the earlier nations to do so. They actually used more of a hardwood and a lighter color of wood And they did go to a paint over phosphate finish. So in the back, the only major difference, notice there's no side rail, was the pistol grip here. Very much inspired by the original style, just kind of simplified. Of course, the difference up here would be the forearm, the metal lower, and the skeletonized just tube without any hardware on it. This also makes it a little easier to control, and FEG always claimed it gave it a little better effective range. Now, since this is built on an SA85, it doesn't have a threaded barrel yet. I will thread it. But these would have normally, in Akm 63, had the muzzle nut, not the slant brake, and not early on. And normally it should have a bayonet lug here too, but again, you know, post-ban gun. We just talked about it, you know. Now note, this does have the ported gas block here. And the handguard retainer is actually a different shape. It's actually smaller and different to work with this grill tap lower. Also has a couple of holes in the front, and it has a unique sling. So we're seeing a few differences, and if we flip it over, we'll see a few more. While the Akm 63 did use the ribbed top cover and all that, it had some AK or either Akm early features like a non-lightning cut bolt carrier. I just found that kind of interesting. You could tell it was kind of an early adoption style. And then another early feature that we don't see on this, but we would see on the AK-63. Despite FEG trying to act like the AK-63 was a whole new platform, really the difference between the Akm-63 and the AK-63F, the handguards. Note that the lower is still a slab side like on an AK, not an AKM. It also has a different shape in the front to work with the different type of retainer up here. But one thing I always felt was kind of interesting about the AK-63, it used a ported gas tube. Very AK Type 3 pattern, which makes this a little funny that this SA85 actually had a ported gas block and a ported gas tube. I talked more about that in the recent video and past videos, but I just wanted to point that out. If you wanted to make this into a slightly newer pattern, just swap the handguards out. Also, the AK-63F and D for that matter would typically have the compensator as opposed to the muzzle nut. Otherwise, yeah, very, very unchanged. So the Hungarian guns are a little different. Again, the handguard retainer is kind of the big thing because that means lower handguards are not just overtly interchangeable. Kind of important. So that kind of concludes our exact or near exact AKMs. Moving from this point on, we're going to get into guns that are more differenter. Now we come to the Chinese Type 56. Again, recently referred to. Hey, if you're going to have a week of AKs, you're going to have some repeats. So I'm not going to go too much into it, but a lot of folks want to consider this an AKM. It's not. It's a Type 56. Or really, if you had to say, is it either an AKM or an AK Type 3? It's more AK Type 3. I picked this one. In the previous video, I showed several variations. China began by making a near exact copy clone of the AK Type 3 in 1956, but around 1960, running through the 1970 period, they would make increasing changes. And the biggest one, they switched from the original machined receiver to this 1.5 millimeter stamped receiver. And this is a wholly unique stamped receiver, especially with the front rivet pattern and the front trunnion styling, because China never had the blueprints, the TDP as we might refer to it as, for the AKM because of relations. That's actually why they continued to use the double hook trigger and never went to the rate reducer either. So basically, the Type 56 is an AK, but with a stamped receiver. It retained the smooth top cover, the non-lightning cut bolt carrier, the ported gas tube, the slab side handguard. It retained the heavier profile 16¼ inch barrel, and it had the unique Chinese enclosed front sight base, originally introduced in 1960. It also retained having a blued finish. Some guns would have the bolt carriers in the white, others would have them blued as well. Yeah, and the buttstock has a bit more of a downward sweep, even though it is a single tang AKM style versus the double tang of the AK Type 3. Oh, and typically wood pistol grips as well. Oh, and as I showed in the previous video, some guns like that Clayco have synthetic furniture too, but it's of the same pattern. It's interchangeable. But there were some Akm features that crept in over the years. Beginning around 1980, and typically just for export, they would start using the slant type compensator. Also, some Type 56s would go to the AKM style bayonet lug here. Not all though, some would continue using Type 1s or even the spiker. I just felt like that was something worth pointing out. I have no idea what just fell. Nothing was even over there, not a cat. They would also move the rear sling swivel from back here on the original mill guns to on the stock for the stamped guns. And they would go to a stamped mag catch versus the early machine style. Then they would retain the 800-meter rear sight with the button on the left instead of the right. And they would still retain the front sling swivel here under the gas block as opposed to here on the retainer. They are just a Type 56. They're kind of in between, using features of both, and then a few features that are just unique to this, like the front sight base. But this is just one of many patterns. They did a lot in China, so for more you can check out my most recent video on them. But I would definitely not call this an AKM. It just doesn't really have anything. It was just a lightened Type 56 that went to the thicker gauge stamped receiver. By the way, one reason that they used the 1.5 was it more closely emulated the spacing, the distance, the thickness of the original milled. Another, if they had to, they could use lower grade steel because it's heavier. Kind of the same reason the Spanish Ruby is a chunky pistol. That's not to say they were using lower grade steel, but if they got into a war situation where they had to mass produce, it was an option kind of built into the pattern. Pretty smart, if I'm being honest. And of course the magazines China built were very similar, but they were the spineless type, which are both maybe easier to handle and a little bit faster to manufacture, if we're being honest too. So I just wanted to bring that attention. Chinese Type 56, not really an AKM. And that would carry on to our next one. Hugo AK. And it likes Chinese mags just fine. For those kind of keeping track at home, you know what comes next. Yugoslavia, Serbia, the Zastava guns. And in some ways these are very similar to the Chinese Type 56. Except Zastava never had a license to manufacture the AK or the AKM. Rather, Zastava would reverse engineer using examples they obtained, and the earliest turnouts were around 1964, and these would be milled guns based on the AK Type 3. And they would go to a simplified mill gun officially adopted as the Akm 70 in 1970. Even though it had a milled receiver, it carried over one important Akm feature, a pressed and pinned in versus screw-in barrel. And that milled receiver would soon give way to a stamped receiver, and they would work with both 1.0 and 1.5 millimeter stamped receivers. While underfolders tended to be either or, fixed stock guns like the M70B1 were pretty much 1.5, and that's where the imports came from. Now, we had some pre-ban imports like the Mitchell you saw there, but they came in very small numbers, and there were some post-ban guns known as the M90s that came in briefly, but because of the Yugoslavian Civil War, it didn't happen much. It wasn't into the modern era that we started to see Serbian-produced examples under the PAP name. That's a story for a whole video, but needless to say, Century Arms took the importation away from EAA back 10 years ago, and soon started bringing over the PAP M70, then the NPAP and OPAP like mine here. And so we finally ended up with some pretty high quality guns, all said. And these are really definitely not AKM types. In fact, they're more different than even the Type 56. The buttstock is a different shape with a rubber recoil pad, no cleaning kit compartment. It actually fits into the back. There are no tangs. It has a socket with a big screw running through, a little bit reminiscent of the AK Type 2, the first milled gun. The stamped receiver is unique. It is heavy duty. Like the RPK light machine gun, it has a bulged front trunnion. It also has a smooth, heavy top cover with a unique retaining pin for takedown. That was actually done because of this up here. One thing that the Yugoslavian People's Army wanted was the ability to launch rifle grenades. So they ended up with this flip-up sight with gas cutoff, and they had a screw-on spigot for the 14mm threads, and so they added this retainer in the back to make sure the cover would not fly off on your face. Again, lots of variations here. From the original AK, it did take the 16¼ inch 450mm barrel, and it is of the heavier profile. And while it was cold hammer forged, it was not chrome lined. In fact, the first 7.62 chrome lined guns were the more recent ZPAPs that came in the last couple of years. Before that, no chrome lining. It has the slab side handguard from the AK, but it's actually longer. Notice the 3 vent slots instead of 2. So it's a longer handguard. So for those keeping track, the handguards, upper or lower, and the buttstock are not interchangeable. Even the pistol grip, while it is nominally interchangeable, is actually a little different. For one thing, the nut is part of the receiver, whereas on an AKM it's removable. So even the pistol grip is not a one-for-one interchange. Even the scope rail, which on the original guns was non-standard, newer guns it is not the exact same pattern. These even had night sights, which I don't think I have the rear on this one right now, do I? No, I've got the front on. Reminds me I need to put the rear night sight on someday. It does have the hole for it. Anyway, flip up night sights. Now originally these had muzzle nuts, later they would have muzzle brakes, and they did use the AKM style bayonet lug, and originally they had the ported gas tube. Later they would go to the ported gas block. But all in all, not many AKM features at all, and not even that many AKs. This is one of the most unique patterns, frankly. Typical finish was blued metal with the bolt group left in the white. Earlier production guns had non-lightning cut carriers. Later productions had the lightning cuts. Same with the bolts. They did have, of course, dimples, yada yada. You notice the front sling swivel is part of the gas block, not the handguard retainer. Yeah, just a radically different pattern. Still very much an AK. Even their magazines, as you know, had the bolt hold open follower. Originally, they actually wanted to have an internal bolt hold open device, kind of like a VZ58, but in the end, they settled for a follower. And because of the heavier receiver, the heavier barrel, the heavier furniture, these are heavier guns, even heavier than a Chinese. They're about 8.25 pounds. So still about a pound lighter than an original AK Type 3, but well over a pound heavier than an AKM. Again, this is a gun like the Chinese. Oh, by the way, different rivet pattern in the back too. Yeah. What's just unique about the Yugos, they never had a license to build these. They did have a license to build the SKS, but that was given very late in production as kind of a goodwill thing. Yugoslavia's position within the communist world was unique in and of itself. So, yeah, it's a thing. But, had to talk about it. So, definitely not an AKM, not even really an AK Type 3. It is, quite frankly, a Zastava M70. It's its own thing. Though very much still a Kalashnikov family gun. Well, I was able to get the majority lined up here. Good enough anyway. I know this is, again, a lot of repeating because there's only so many AKs and I've done specific videos on most of these. But I was trying to think of a good video that would wrap up AK week. And this is a question that gets brought up more than once. And people often call something an AKM when it's not, and sometimes don't kind of talk about the imports we've had. As I kind of teased at the beginning of the video, Bulgaria never made an AKM. Really not anything close. They did begin producing the original AK, and they would carry that over with the machined receiver all the way until they began manufacturing the AK-74 series, which did have a stamped receiver. But after that time, in the 1990s, they very quickly went back to the milled receiver guns. Even if you see a stamped receiver 7.62x39 gun out of Bulgaria, for example the SLR 107, it's basically a combination of original AK Type 3 and AK-74. They just did not do the AKM. The closest they ever came was about 15 years ago. They teased doing the SLR 108, but it never went into production and never was sold here. Bulgaria just kind of skipped over it based on its circumstances. And as many know, Czechoslovakia, Czech Republic today, did their own thing. They did the VZ58, followed decades later by the 805 Bren. They never did an AK, an AKM, or an AK-74. Yeah. Other nations use the AK but never built it. And then you have nations like Finland and Israel that really did their own thing. If I was doing a video on the AK Type 3, I would definitely bring out the Bayonets. But they really don't have a place in the AKM video. That's just never really where they went. Same goes with the Galil, if I'm being honest. And of course there's a few guns that I just simply can never show you. For example, North Korean. But I've done my best to try to give you a decent overview. I hope anyway. And again, I've been able to get most on the table that we talked about today. So if you're in the market for a semi-automatic based on the AKM and you want an import, your best options are either a Mahdi or one of the Romanian guns. SAR-1, if you find it, you get the magwell dimples, but these were made during the ban era, so you won't get the bayonet lug, and they don't have threaded barrels. I threaded mine later, of course, as you know. But there's absolutely nothing wrong with the Wasser 10. There's also the recently imported WBP guns like the Fox and the Jack. Those are very close to AKM as well. So that's good. And there's a lot of cool parts kits out there, like this East German or the Polish we looked at, or even Russians like we looked at. So there's a lot of good parts kits builds if you want to go that route for an AKM. Actually, for a long time, it was kind of hard to find a pretty authentic AKM outside of the Wasser, believe it or not. And the Hungarian guns, like I said, they're very close, but they're just a little bit different, namely in the fitting of the lower handguard. And I really like them. And there have been some parts kits, AK-63Fs and Ds recently, or relatively recently. And in the past, there were quite a few AMD-65 kits, but the AMD-65 is kind of its own thing. There have been very few AKM-63 kits come in, though. There were quite a few more of the milled AK-55s. I really like the Hungarian guns. For a long time, they were kind of overlooked, underappreciated. I think these days they're getting quite a bit of just due. I wouldn't say their machining is quite as good as East German or Polish, but it's superior to either Egyptian or Romanian overall, in my opinion. And then moving down here, the Chinese. Again, I've recently talked about them, so I probably said everything I could think to say in that video. Unfortunately, the Chinese guns were banned in April of 1994. So we kind of have what we have. Luckily, they did bring over 1 million Mac 90s and pre-banned guns like the AKS 56S. And in recent years, there have been a few parts kits finally come in, like the James River guns, which I've actually heard pretty good things about overall. But if you do one, know that they have their own receiver pattern, and they use the heavier profile barrel. They're just a bit of their own critter. So some stuff will not directly interchange, including like lower handguards. They kind of use more of a AK type 3 pattern lower versus AKM. And then finally, the last one we talked about, the Yugo pattern. Like I just said, they're a Zastava M70. There's probably fewer parts that are interchangeable than are not interchangeable with AKM. Yeah, they just do their own thing, which is cool. And as I've said in many videos, if you don't want a WBP or a Wasser, the Zastava ZPAP is an excellent choice and maybe the most economical right now. But just know that furniture will be specific to this gun. But Zastava USA has done a great service by bringing a lot of these over. So that's the general. I've done up-close videos on each of these countries, but I hope that's kind of satisfied and was a bit of a good end to this week with a lot of stressful and troubling things going on. Guys, I just want to share something that I enjoy. I enjoy the history, the mechanics, and just, my passion for that. I also notice that most of my guns tend to be older wood and steel, but that's just me. I like good old wood furniture. Nothing against the modern tactical stuff, but I'm kind of more in the Cold War era, because that's what I studied at university, and it's kind of what got me into these many, many years ago. So I hope you've enjoyed this week, and if I've whetted your appetite, you might check out the backlog on the channel, because we've got quite a few. We've got 1 or 2 AK videos around here. Well, like I said at the beginning, if you please could like, share, and subscribe, it greatly helps out. And do feel free to comment too. I read every comment and I respond as often as I'm able. And if you'd like to help support the channel as we go into the second half of 2022, there is a link to the Patreon page in the description. With that, this is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.